Hi, Vaish. Hi, Sam. Thank you for joining us, and welcome to Moral Mayhem. Today, we're joined by Sam Hammond, who is a senior economist at the Foundation for American Innovation, where he works on questions relating to AI and the potentially transformative impact it could have on our institutions. Sam also writes a popular Substack newsletter called Second Best, which is how Vaish and I came across his work. And he's also a fellow Canadian. So, welcome, Sam. Thanks so much for joining us. And just to start off, would you mind just telling us a little bit about how you got involved in this space?
Yeah, sure. You guys suppressed the fact that you have a Canadian connection, so I'd be interested to dig into that as well because there seems to be a lot of AI coming out of Canada. Um, I guess I was just a young, very online kid who's interested in philosophy, science, uh, politics, and went. I read a lot of the singularity stuff, like Age of Spiritual Machines and things like that, and sort of went down that singularity rabbit hole when I was a teenager, and then blended that with interest in libertarianism and political philosophy. Um, and the thing about going back to Canada, the thing about Canada is there is no real think tank ecosystem, and because the parties are sort of well structured and have their own internal processes to come up with their platforms and so on, whereas in the U.S. everything seems to be outsourced. Nonetheless, as an America watcher, I was always very interested in how policy worked in the U.S. and wanting to go where things were interesting because Canada was frankly kind of boring. And so early on, I was at the Mercatus Center at George Mason as a tech policy fellow, working on breakthrough technology. I worked on supersonic aviation, consumer drones, that kind of thing. Um, and at the same time, I was sort of going through this evolution in my thinking around libertarianism because, as Tyler Cowen talks about, he has this piece called The Paradox of Libertarianism. The Industrial Revolution was this kind of package deal, and people who sort of lament that we've left that sort of laissez-faire stage and now we have big bureaucracies and welfare states. We're missing the dynamics that made the welfare state and dynamic markets and free trade sort of a package deal. And so I wrote a paper called The Free Market Welfare State that was all about how instead of resisting that, we should create a reform agenda around constructing social safety nets and social insurance systems to promote entrepreneurship, to compensate the losers from trade or technology shocks and so forth. And so that led me to a diversion for the last 7 or 8 years at the Niskanen Center, where I directed their social policy program, working mostly on social welfare policy, child tax credits and things like that. But always with that sort of through that lens of creating the kind of complementary institutions for dynamism and innovation. And now that AI was taking off, I decided to get back to my roots and joined FAI.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about think tanks as like outsourced political party. I didn't think about it that way, but that makes a lot of sense, and it kind of jives with the general idea of institutions as competing in a competitive framework that depends on technology and other things like that. But
Yeah, maybe let's actually just start there. So, like you do in some of your posts, like by grounding this in a little bit of historical precedent for how we can view institutions as not as these sort of like static structures that you must take as givens, but as things that compete with each other and can be influenced by uh, especially sort of transformative technologies. And you talk about the printing press, so maybe let's start there and like give us your theory of sort of like institutional evolution, if you will, and how that might apply to AI, and I'm sure we'll talk a bunch about that.
Yeah, I guess I come at it through a very institutional economics kind of lens. Ronald Coase, Douglas North, transaction costs, all that kind of stuff. Um, and I also sort of see a continuum between different kinds of organizations in the state, right? You can think of governments as kind of like corporations at a certain level, right? And so a lot of this thinking actually came out of trying to reconcile my political views with the anarchists I knew. And if you get into deep debates of anarcho-capitalists, eventually you realize, oh, there's going to be private security firms that are doing the governing, and then there's going to be like incentives for them to collude and to like get economies of scale. All of a sudden we have a state again, right? So the emergence of the state formation and the emergence of states is, I think, very parallel to the emergence of corporations. And the things that the reason we have corporations and organizations in general is because there are some things that are more efficient to do in house and vertically integrate, and some things that are more efficient to do through the market. And the same is true of governments, right? Most advanced governments have some kind of universal insurance for healthcare. Very few, like the NHS in Britain, actually have government-run hospitals, right? Because the market failure is in insurance, they're not in the provision of the actual medicine, doctors, and so forth. And so, you look across the sort of equilibrium we're in now, liberal democratic capitalism, the last, say, 200, 300 years. I think of that as a technologically contingent equilibrium where governments, there's obviously much weaker competitive pressure on governments than there are on corporations that can fail. And we even create structures to, accelerate their failure and churn. But nonetheless, governments are in some ways buffeted by those efficiency demands and the logic of transaction cost. And so if you look at the printing press as an example, it's an example where one part of one the cost for one sort of unit or one factor fell dramatically, right? The cost of information and dissemination of information. Um, and that's also the period where we went from sort of medieval kind of institutions where famously, you could be a few hundred miles apart but have different units of measurement and things like that, to the rise of sort of more centralized governments where Napoleon sort of lays down a standard unit of measurement, and we have these new economies of scale. And that was really kicked off by the scientific revolution and the printing press, which also put a lot of strain on that older sort of institutional setup. And that's why we had wars of religion and English Civil War and all the tumult that went on in the period.
I was actually it's funny, like when we emailed you, I was in the middle of reading this book, Managerial Dilemmas by Gary Miller, which is just it's sort of, I think, as someone who hasn't sort of studied institutional economics formally, it's just a great sort of introduction into why hierarchies form to start with. And so it's so if you think about kind of the two reasons that I think you lay out for why you would want more centralization or hierarchy, one is transaction costs, and the other is information asymmetry. So to for a simple example, if you're a company that wants to get a new product out, you could imagine a world where transaction cost was zero and you could just contract it out to the best engineers and do it that way. But given that's not the world we live in, and we have imperfect information about the labor market and vice versa, you end up sort of like centralizing authority, right? And how does that, how do you see that sort of like landscape evolving as we speak, especially when it comes to AI?
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess if there's any deeper theme to all my AI writing, is that we tend to focus on the first order effects of technology and neglect the second order, and the second order tends to be the thing that dominates in the long run, right? So, take the Industrial Revolution. There's a recent MBER paper showing using the build out of telegraph and rail lines to explain the growth of the federal administration, because without telegraph and road lines and the ability to sort of get across the country quickly, it was difficult to have sort of principals that were in DC controlling their agents on the West Coast or whatever. And so I think of the last 200 years as sort of being a one-sided story where the kinds of costs that were falling favored scale, favored hierarchy, favored institutional consolidation. Um, and where I see AI going, if you think about all the core transaction costs, I think of information asymmetry as part of that, right? It's information friction. Bargaining, search information, monitoring, all those costs are plummeting as we speak, right? We have, with large language models, one of the first applications is content moderation. And now that they've gotten so cheap to run, you have Activision saying that they're going to have, LLMs just continuously monitoring kids on Call of Duty for, things that violate the TOS. And so you can quickly, extrapolate that across all kinds of forms, right? All kinds of institutions, all kinds of regulatory purposes, will we need in the future a USDA that sends out farm inspectors to commercial farms, and it's every 2 years when they're on their best behavior, or will we have cameras in the farms that are intelligent, that have multimodal capabilities, and will write up a report if you kick a chicken, right? All these constants sort of become variables, and I think that's where a lot of the most interesting disruption is going to be.
And
Mhm.
so, how do you think about
And
like the?
oh,
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna give one example that you gave in one of your blogs, which helped me understand the concept, which was like the Uber versus taxi example. So the idea being that, we had to have taxis that, you got medallions for because we needed some way to make sure that the driver was okay and some quality moderation and knowing the number to call and all of that. And then with Uber, that got completely outcompeted because we had a self-reinforcing system of reviewing people and algorithms to match people to drivers and moderate prices and all of that. So that I think I just to motivate the discussion of
Yeah.
like where we're going from there. So yeah, just how do you see centralization being impacted as AI becomes more capable, and maybe if you could give a little bit of like the timeline of some of the scale of changes, because I was a little bit alarmed by some of the timelines on a few of your posts, but yeah.
Yeah, so I guess I have, relative to the man on the street, short timelines to human level intelligence, whatever you want to call that, right? And I also tend to separate sort of the metaphysical debate whether AGI is like intelligent the same way humans are, or not, or if like we're just sort of creating really sophisticated uh, emulations. That to me is less interesting than, like, as a matter of fact, is the system capable of replacing human intelligence in XYZ area? Um, and if you look at like the Metechless forecasts, they say weak AGI by 2026, strong AGI by 2031, where the operation is something like a fully unified system and a robot with robot control, that if you gave it uh, a scaled down Ferrari, it could assemble it, sight unseen without any training. And I think you see some of the recent robot demos, and you think, well, we're actually not that far off from that. And scaling more generally, I think, is basically going to bring us pretty close. And so, what happens there, right? What happens when you have not just really good chatbots that can do sort of things in zero shot or few shot, but systems that have a degree of agency and can do long tasks over long horizons, can plan for themselves, right? And then are cheap enough that you could spin up thousands of instances of them, right? So if you take the back to the transaction cost framework, well, basically the principal agent problem no longer exists, right? And a lot of what a lot of the role of a corporation and hierarchy and centralization is to deal with those agency costs, right? The reason you don't contract for something sometimes is because you don't trust the contractor. Maybe they don't even show up for the job, and so you pull that in house. So you have a supervisor that's looking down on the person. We're going to have the ability, by we I mean like you and me and anybody that has access to the API, or if there's open source versions, to construct tens of thousands of effective person entities that are going around doing all kinds of productive things for them, and that makes the world much less legible, right? From the point of view of the state, and this is sort of the counterintuitive thing, because there's this sort of idea going back to Peter Thiel, that crypto is libertarian and AI is communist, because AI, this reduction in monitoring costs means that we're going to have big surveillance states. And I think if you had a Chinese setup, that's definitely the path of least resistance. But in a sort of more polycentric order that we have, that we're as our starting line, I think it leads to fragmentation.
So you're saying it's like contingent on the starting conditions, right? So it's not like libertarian or communist per se, but it's really the structures in which these technologies evolve that kind of direct what they'll end up looking like in terms of.
Yeah,
There's a lot of path dependence in terms of where institutions end up.
yeah, both the literal path dependence and also the ways in which open societies, sort of, our governments tie their hands, right? Um, the EU just finally passed the EU AI Act. One of the things it does is prohibit law enforcement from using biometric AI and other sort of predictive policing and things like that. Um, so there, our governments in the West tie our hands, right? But that doesn't mean that it's a free for all, right? If you go into a Walmart, you still don't have freedom of speech, right? If you go into a casino, there's cameras tracking your every move, um, and so that tends to be why I think as AI diffuses and creates a variety of negative externalities, right? My ability to spy on you goes up and stuff like that. There's going to be demand for ways of internalizing those externalities, like in a casino, having a camera track you everywhere you go. And our governments are going to be bound by our constitutional traditions from implementing those things for good or ill.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean that the demand for those things goes away. It means it gets decentralized into company towns and other sort of para political institutions.
So do you envision like forming sort of because I think there's a level at which if you analyze it, it looks sort of dystopian because you have these islands of surveillance, even if they're not sort of like all encompassing. So there's still public space that isn't infringed upon, but a lot of private spaces are. But isn't it? Wouldn't it also be true that we've solved a lot of coordination problems that we can't solve today within those spaces? So you have, sort of like near utopian spaces. You give kind of like Singapore's everywhere. Is that what you expect?
That would be a great outcome, right? Like I don't have a crystal ball, so I don't know how things really go. It could be that I have a vision of a kind of intermediate world that lasts like 2 years before we're all uploaded or something. Um, so that would be like the ideal outcome, that we sort of have a patchwork of high competence organizations that that aren't under the same the reason liberalism is associated with sort of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, is because you had people with different religions and different ideas living under one structure. And if that starts to unravel and separate, then you'll have like the LDS utopia that where they don't serve you coffee or beer, and that'll be great for some people, but not for me. Um, so ideally, you'd want a degree of interjurisdictional competition to keep those to keep our de facto rights in any particular place
And to your point,
reasonable, so people can exit, right?
right. And people would be opting in, opting in because, as you said, there's a demand for these um, protections to the changing privacy norms, et cetera, that are enabled by AI. So yeah, like I think, and as you point out, like while we don't allow the government to restrict freedom of speech and all of this stuff, in actuality, in our day jobs, in our lives, we voluntarily accept tons of restrictions on our freedoms. And so this would sort of just be an expansion of that to all areas of life as the technological change created that additional demand for more control by some, bigger agent. Is that kind of the right way of thinking about it?
Yeah, you could easily imagine a near-term future where having a jailbroken iPhone is dangerous, right? And so, will there be areas where, sort of like schools these days, a lot of schools in the US have metal detectors and stuff like that, where you have to get like the nerfed phone that still has a browser and stuff, but doesn't or is only running like the approved models or something. Um, like I said, I don't really, get it, the more detail you get into, the harder it is, the more just like raw speculation it becomes. I would say at a high level, I think anyone who's anticipating the government and our institutions as they exist today to persist out 20 years will be proven wrong. And that leaves open sort of a fog about like what those new institutions look like. But you can be more certain that things will change than in knowing the final destination.
'Cause I guess the one question that comes up is if you look at something like freedom of speech or things that are in the instances where they're restricted, like maybe outside of America, they're restricted because of some propensity for harm, right? Which hasn't occurred yet. So there's a, sort of like this restricting freedoms on that basis because we can't be deterministically sure what the outcome will be. So we err on the side of caution. I could imagine a situation where AI solves, that piece of like maybe you could also have islands where freedoms are maximized as insofar as it increases your ability to intervene right at the point of harm rather than on grounds of prospective harm. Does that seem plausible to you at all?
with like a benign singleton that is, know, that is only, maybe. I mean, that's sort of like how teachers at recess operate, right? Uh, there's it's the people are just really underestimating how easy it's going to be to, ask your killer drone to attack somebody with these particular characteristics or whatever. And we have a Second Amendment in the U.S., right? And so like a lot of the message of the AI Leviathan series was just to point out how counterintuitive um, the outcomes could be based on sort of your proximal values. Your proximal values are more freedom, right? And so you agitate for more open source, aggressively, sort of like democratizing things. But the lesson from history is that can, in aggregate, in collective, once you take into account collective action and the kind of the sort of general equilibrium dynamics, can lead to a less free outcome than one where there's a more controlled evolution.
In some ways, you're highlighting a more optimistic, like I can imagine much more pessimistic case, right? Which is
Mhm.
if the offense defense sort of balance tips on the offense side, i.e., like it just makes like it's just the case that our surveillance technology is much less good than our autonomous weapons or bioweapons or things that can cause asymmetric harm. Then you would pray that you would have a good enough surveillance state, but like you're probably not like guaranteed it, I guess. Even though I guess it's at least from how it's evolving now, it seems like AI should be at least good at surveillance tasks a priori.
Oh, it definitely is, right. And the other thing it raises questions is sort of our um, existing constitutional protections against sort of like dragnet surveillance and things like that adequate, right? Because right now, my understanding is like, after since Edward Snowden spilled the beans, the U.S. does a lot of dragnet surveillance of metadata and things like that. However, if it's U.S. citizens on U.S. soil, that's supposed to be in a black box that you can only get access to if you go through a FISA court, right? But as far as I know, there's no rule saying that you couldn't have a human level agent that is not actually a human, doesn't isn't treated as a human in the law, be the thing that's like filtering that metadata and assigning a probability that this is a person that will pass a warrant, right? Um, so so I think it's going to be this competition, and that's why I don't think that the state will just collapse, right? I think what is more likely is that there will be pockets of competence that carry forward, and then sort of competing centers of power, right? The free city of Solona County, and with all the ML engineers who they declare an autonomous zone or something like that.
Yeah, I just to get your take on it. It's like this. I think these scenarios can sound somewhat dystopian in the sense that they involve a lot of change, but there is also positive upside, from having the ability to have all these AI workers and all of that in the future. But do you mind just like what's your take on the doomer scenarios? Like, are you mostly confident that because of the competitive dynamics at play and the ability to opt into various systems, like do you buy into the idea of like AI being like losing control of AI and this kind of thing as a real concern, or is it more just that we're going to have so much transformative change so quickly that we might not, like, our institutions are not capable of adapting quickly enough, and there'll be a lot of eggs getting broken in the interim, but eventually, we'll get onto some kind of new equilibrium that could have much higher levels of human flourishing.
Yeah, part of what the reason I've written the things I've written is partly because I saw a dearth in scenario imagining for these sort of middle scenarios. And I guess if I have any one complaint with the doomer, the P doom kind of discourse, is that by doom, you know, traditionally what is meant by that is like total human extinction and potentially even like extinction throughout the light cone, right? Because like the replicators just go on replicating and colonizing galaxies and stuff like that. That is such a high bar that I think it ends up distracting from the conversation. I don't put zero credence on that outcome, right? Maybe 1%, 2%. And then the uncertainty bounds around that are so huge. Um, but if we, I think if you took the average congressperson or average public official and said, this will only kill 2 billion people, so we're not going to make this one of our EA cause areas because it's not deadly enough, right? Um, we should be planning for a whole bunch of different contingencies. Um, and part of like what my writing has been about is sort of like what happens if alignment isn't like the true technical alignment problem isn't as hard as we think, but we still end up with powerful systems that, well, they don't just go off autonomously destroying everything, do what
Mhm.
we say, right? And there are also risks that come from having systems that are very powerful that are controllable because we all have very different interests.
Mhm.
Yeah, and it seems like even if people, are skeptical of the AI takeover case, which I think there's objectively less sort of, at least by traditional standards, the type of evidence isn't super robust, or not the forms we're used to seeing, at least. But I think when it comes to things like misuse, like I feel like there's sort of like relative mispricing of those two things, right? Like I would have much more resources focused on sort of lobbying against being too sanguine about open source models, putting guardrails in place, having more money into misuse, and intelligence agencies getting up to speed with sort of like how to deal with AI. But it feels like the discourse is sort of like very heavy on the takeover side.
Yeah, and even some of the you know accelerationists who they have a vision of takeover that's positive, right? Richard Sutton has recently been giving talks called preparing for succession planning, where he says, we're building our mind children, and they're going to be made in our image, but they're going to be better than us, and we're going to either merge or retire and let them succeed us. And I just think that there's so many ways that kind of post-human transition could go wrong. uh, in the same way that like civilization kind of went wrong. We got less disease and longer lifespans and so on and so forth, but yet we were evolved for a particular evolutionary niche of sort of hunter-gatherer communitarian kind of lifestyles, and we have all this anxiety and alienation that has come out of that. The more we continue forking away from our biological origins, uh, it's not that we achieve some greater transcendence. My worry is that we just realize that the world is kind of meaningless, and once you've sort of broken out of our of our like life world where we have meaning by dint of all having relatively similar software, that there's just nothing beyond that, uh, and that could be something that we enter into not because there's some single system that takes over, but just because we're all following our local incentives.
Right. Yeah. And you kind of you touch on this in the limits to explosive growth post that you have, just which I thought, yeah, I really like the conclusion, which is sort of touching on the fact of like, as humans exist, there's only so much subjective well-being that we can probably get per person, and it's probably going to be maximized in some kind of environment or society that replicates the important elements of our evolutionary environment. um, so yeah, could you talk a little bit about sort of, let's say, alignment goes perfectly, we get through the tumultuous period of institutional change, we settle at a new equilibrium, the AIs are doing what we want, they're creating more positive subjective experience for more humans. But to your point, perhaps that requires us to not be aware of the AIs, and we're in like, did you see us like, would that in your mind, is this like we're in some kind of matrix scenario where we don't know we're in the matrix, and that's the only way for us to have subjective well-being, and the AIs are looking out for us in that way, and then just trying to colonize more and more land and resources so that they can create more conscious humans to have positive welfare experiences?
Um, I mean, that's one possible outcome. I think it really points to the limits of utilitarian thinking, right? And sort of repugnant conclusion kind of outcomes. Um, there are folks like Robin Hanson for whom that would be like the right way, the right path forward, right? You
Mhm.
know, more people all living basically at subsistence, but more is better. Um, I think there's, I, I just think our moral theories are kind of we're confused about our moral theories. We tend to think that utilitarianism or deontology or these sort of like high level theories are actually theories in the sense of explaining that they explain something or they justify something. When I tend to think of them more as vocabularies, like very refined, distilled vocabularies that we extrapolate from the norms that begin in practice, right? And any philosophy that sort of ends up flipping that order of priority, that makes the theory precede the practice, is going to lead to pathologies, right? It's
Mhm.
going to lead to people flipping coins to destroy Earth or double it.
Sorry, can I
Um,
clarify that? Do you mean something like our evolved moral intuitions are what's real in some sense of sort of like what subjectively is true, and then the tools of language that we use to sort of put that out into the environment and express those to each other uh, tend to sort of the philosophy is an emergent phenomenon from that, but
yeah,
isn't
they get
necessarily something
reified. Mhm.
right.
Yeah.
Interesting. Um,
That's always been the danger of utopian movements, right? Is because they tend to be reifying some kernel, some aspect of our moral life, and on the tech skill tree, like putting all their points on that and saying this is actually what morality is about.
Mhm.
Right, but insofar as like we have some plurality in these values and what we care about, like even now, right? I mean, I often have arguments with people who have this sort of like mindset of, well, struggle is good. There's intrinsic value in struggle, right? And you see people, and they do actually. I mean, I think some of them are mistaken, but a lot of them do live their lives on those principles. I mean, we were recently talking about women who choose not to get epidurals, right? And is, even despite sort of like the safety statistics, and it makes me think like as we make progress, will growth or economic activity just be about trading different values and peaks in well-being according to our own sort of like systems, and then we can still sort of like move towards whatever is our you know uh, maximum for on an individual level or a collective level, but we still have sort of like room to trade that with each other in some ways.
I guess I just reject that mode of like analysis that there's some kind of like well-being landscape and we're looking for the optima. I think that's a useful approximation if you're doing like cost benefit analysis or something like that, but it's just not how I think of morality. And how I think of morality as endogenous to uh, groups of interacting people who are trying to create rules to cooperate with each other and bind
Mhm.
themselves to norms. And those norms those norms are constructed and only valid insofar as they're like reciprocally recognized by people in that community. And then sometimes those norms, you can have the philosopher who's sitting there trying to extract the logic implicit in a norm, right, and then make just that pure logic the thing. And I think that's where you end up creating Sam Bankman-Frieds. And I think that we want to avoid
Mhm.
that, right? Because there's a very fine line between uh, a perfect utilitarian and a sociopath.
So given that then, like what would differentiate a good versus a bad outcome of, transformative our world being transformed by AI? Like if you don't think about morality as sort of having these peaks in the landscape of welfare, like how would you differentiate? Is it just the degree to which people are able to coordinate and cooperate?
Yeah, I guess I would say that I think not just morality, but like meaning is kind
Hmm.
of endogenous to uh, a language game of some sort, right? Of having a group of beings with similar software playing a similar game, um, and so I think to me like that. So first of all, there's sort of the evolution through the cultural evolution, the normative evolution, and I think it's important that be kind of you know uh, continuous, analytical and continuous, or whatever. That we build off of what came before, and not have like really sharp breaks. And then secondly, that we retain our kind of humanness, because that humanness and that common software like all our meaning, all our morality is endogenous to that. And if
Mhm.
we start actually forking our biology in radical ways, then it's not that things have gone wrong. It's that literally the ground of meaning has disappeared.
There is no wrong, basically, right?
Right.
Like then right. And so like let's just, and I think this is going to keep coming up, so it's an interesting topic, and we can probably talk about this uh, for a while, but um, just to ground this in some of your kind of forecasts about growth, and how AI will drive growth, especially in juxtaposition to sort of the paper you were responding to by Tom Davidson from Open Philanthropy. And I think you know, the open fill or model in this sort of AI safety world of AI driving growth is something like, well, if you just extrapolate from the endogenous growth model, in the past you had ideas about or technology that created growth and welfare, and food, which created more people, that created more ideas, and the cycle goes on, right? And the sort of conclusion they draw from this is that because AI, transformative AI, by definition means replacing, most of what human beings can do, you could just remove labor out of that equation, and then you get a self-reinforcing feedback loop that leads that leads to explosive growth up into infinity, right? And so why do you think that's wrong, and how and where do you disagree? And like we want to parse sort of your forecast, but also just sort of like how you would juxtapose that against people that have made that assumption.
Sure. There are a few ways into the topic. I guess I don't foreclose possibilities where we have some that we're on like some finite time singularity and that growth is going to go hyperbolic. I would just say that those scenarios are I would consider them catastrophic, right? Because the only way that happens is if we have like massive property rights violations, massive like whatever it means to be human has changed dramatically. What that growth even means, right? Just get into this in the piece. Like growth, GDP is not some objective quantity. It's a measure of value, and that value is subjective. And if we're just building mega projects throughout the galaxy and there's no one there to experience them, that's not really GDP. Uh, so so I think in the worlds where that singularity does happen are worlds where the meaning of GDP, the meaning of growth and value there's a structural break, and it becomes impossible to really compare um, different time periods. Uh, Reasons for why that might not happen. Well, one is that like these endogenous growth models have been known since their invention in the 80s that they're very susceptible to these knife edge conditions where if you tweak the parameter just right, you have to tweak the parameters just right to prevent explosive growth, right? Because the original endogenous growth models just would explode hyperbolically just from more population growth. Because more people meant more ideas, which were non-rival, which meant more invention, which meant more people, and obviously that's not what we see. You know, growth is endogenous to a large degree, and it's even underrated in the among non-economists, right? You educate your population,
Mhm.
more human capital means that it can create more growth, which means they can create better education, so on down the line. Um, I think the work that's been done is so you can level like one high level critique, which is like it's just way too formal, right? Way too out of distribution to really trust that these actually extrapolate, and leveraging this sort of quirk of endogenous growth models that has long been understood to be not a feature but a bug of the model. Um, Secondly, the way it works in all the ones I've seen is that you cross some threshold where you're able to create an AI, worker, researcher, what have you, who can you can throw at R&D, and even if R&D has diminishing returns, you can just throw proportionally more AI workers at the problem, and so it's sort of this unfalsifiable thing. And then what is that R&D even right? Is it pure scientific discovery and novelty, right? Like in that sense science is an endless frontier because we can like map the connectome of the shrimp or something like that, but that doesn't have any economic utility. um, Things that have utility are like you know, more bigger houses, you know, bigger TVs, like nicer food, whatever, like things that humans enjoy and consume. And that consumption element ends up being the core thing that I think holds these forecasts back, because all growth, all output, all income is someone else's consumption. And if you have supply that takes off without commensurate growth and demand, then we're either in a world where all returns are going to capital and we've been pushed into subsistence and it's just the robots feeding the robots, or your modeling assumptions are wrong.
Right. So I'm guessing part of the contention is around uh, so there so is it true to say their model is basically not assuming any diminishing returns of ideas, or it's saying yes there's diminishing returns of ideas, but like insofar as you can produce the additional AI system or a copy of AI system at like zero marginal cost, you'll just have that offsetting each other, something like that?
Yeah, correct. Yeah,
But I
essentially,
think you're
it's not it's you know all these models are accumulating inputs, right? And in a normal production function, there's an exponent on capital and labor, and those are less than one, right? And that means that you add more capital, you get less back than the first increment of capital. And as long as they're able to say, well, we can just compensate for that by throwing more AI labor at the problem, they're essentially assuming a can opener. They're assuming that there's no diminishing returns.
So I think this doesn't like. I think the second thing you said about sort of like you still have to produce something of value, and value is intrinsically linked to scarcity. Totally buy that, and that's sort of like I think the ultimate rebuttal. But I think on the only way I could see like diminishing returns of ideas being counteracted is if there's a fair amount of correlation between how human researchers think, and there's some like orthogonal, dimension of research that AIs are able to, like similar to how AIs can think of like Go strategies that the best human players can't think of, right? Then perhaps it's like even the quality of innovation or how quickly they can find ideas is in a space that wasn't accessible. Now, I don't know how plausible that is. That seems like a very deep scientific question that I don't have the answer to, but it seems like it's a theoretical possibility.
My dad doesn't have a smartphone, right? He's had the same refrigerator for 30 years. So there could be a world where we get a new dishwasher every 6 months because the dishwasher technology is just
Mhm.
going off into like 5,000 ELO level dishwashers. But we tend to be satisficers, and um, I haven't done this calculation, but someone could. Like, there's only so much data that passes through our eyes, ears, nose, and tongue, right? And our ability to consume things that could be in principle produced is throttled, right? And so maybe there will be people who have the neural link upgrade and are able to appreciate these things, but these I think these bottlenecks, especially the consumption side bottleneck, it's not it's less of a bottleneck than something that has to be bootstrapped with the growth, and that doesn't prevent us from entering a new growth regime or to have much more accelerated growth. It just means that hyperbolic scenarios only happen where you take the human out of the picture.
Or could it not be that the human is altered in some fundamental way that they're able to appreciate new products or something, and um we might appreciate our humanness as it exists, but this is like just an extreme. I think Robin Hanson has talked about sort of like, different people have anxiety that the next generation is going to have different values and desires than they do. And yeah, just how do you think about that with respect to the potential to modify what it means to be human in a way that would change the values or I know you said you don't think about it in terms of like welfare maximizing, but in a way where like there would be more subjective benefits to growth for longer for these humanoid beings or whatever, our descendants.
Yeah, so I sort of suggest that, like, if you had some kind of neural link or something like that. There is obviously the reductio ad absurdum that if you could live in a virtual matrix kind of simulation, that there's no goods or services that are being produced per se. It's just the cost of electricity, and you can live in whatever world you want. I think Robin overstates the degree to which our values are change over time. I think if you could drop into ancient Sumeria and just observe, you would see a lot of very similar patterns of behavior, very similar interests, status games, concerns, and they treated women differently and they prayed to different gods and stuff like that. But the aperture of that kind of normative evolution is a lot less narrow. Um, it's not narrow in some cosmic sense, right? And this is why you wouldn't want someone like Robin to be in charge of these decisions, because he's able to sort of depersonalize and detach and try to imagine what it would be like to be the 10,000 AD civilization where everyone has uploaded and we've like re-engineered our preferences to just
Hmm.
be maximally like colonizing and stuff like that. Um, I almost think of that as like so amoral, right? It might be like descriptively what will happen, but this goes back to like the effective accelerationists and their whole philosophy. Beth Bezos, the leader of it, he's talked on podcasts about he grew up in Quebec, so he was you know had a sort of francophone Catholic upbringing, lost his faith, and then went through a period of like nihilism where he thought there was no meaning in the world, and then he discovered that uh, rocks roll downhill. And that's the meaning of the universe. It's that the universe is trying to minimize some variational free energy function, and so we just need to do that and align ourselves to that. And I think of that as a very poor replacement, right? Like to me, morality is this like web of beliefs and norms and things that we co-create, not this function that we optimize. Um, and so in that sense, the accelerationists and the effective altruists have like a lot in common, right? They just have different functional forms.
Hmm.
But
Yeah.
in that world, like if you take him seriously, and I think it's worth taking him seriously, like the accelerationists seriously, because they do have a point that if you look retrospectively throughout history of the universe, it does seem to be like these very generic processes of distributive adaptation and free energy minimization give rise to higher levels of organization to better turn entropy into heat, and that process will continue. And we had the Cambrian explosion. We're going to have another Cambrian explosion, and we should just uh, work on that, work on behalf of the universe's true purpose. Um,
Hmm.
and to me, I think that's just like it doesn't solve the nihilism problem. He thinks it does, but it doesn't.
Hmm. Yeah, just I think your point about Robin overestimating the generational changes is kind of proven just by the fact that we still get so much value out of like ancient philosophy and old novels and things like that. There's um we
I
don't
think about this
have.
all the time.
Yeah, it and the fact that people get so much value out of psychedelic experiences and nature and things that kind of connect us to our evolved past. But um
So that's one place where a lot of, Robin had a big influence on me because he has this sort of forager morality, agricultural morality dichotomy. Um, and my story about us sort of like going to the like fully automated luxury communism where we're all living in some like high tech neo traditional society is that kind of like return to the forager.
Mhm.
Um, and that's how where I hope we land, right? Uh, because it not because it's cosmically the true thing, but because it's the thing that sort of it's the glove that fits our hand.
Right.
Yeah, it's like it's viewing our the human project is through the lens of a being a biological creature that's evolved rather than something that is that has sort of this abstract significance beyond our human bodies and that can transmit value through the universe in some way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like what are the most popular games right now, right? Like Helldivers, there's like the battle royales. Like I play a lot of video games, and I can't help but feel like what I'm doing is sort of calling back to some hunter
Mm.
instinct where I'm with my boys and we're going to like hunt down something. Um, and even like I have ADHD and I've even read like Evo psych theories. Maybe it's just a just so story, but there's one theory of ADHD as adaptive for
Hunting, right?
hunting. Yeah,
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 yeah.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, that's interesting. So I think the one sort of piece of it that I can't quite make sense of is you see, and this is, in some ways just true of me as well, and like a lot of people I know, where since the internet, like I, I think, especially if you're not someone with a social media addiction problem, and generally internet's a net positive in your life, which it certainly is in mine, that I think I've started to sort of or question whether there is this realm of value that's about just intellectual exploration and just information consumption, which I think a bunch of very wealthy people seem to spend a lot of their time just exploring ideas and sort of talking about things. Now, I wonder if that is that, my sense is that still has to be grounded in reality and have like real life stakes to make it sort of stimulating. Um, but I guess in that sort of um, search space of value seeking, I see that the limits are, I can see a more limitless sort of possibility.
yeah. I mean, to your point, this is why I'm not a wealth maxer, right? Because I look at the billionaires in my people, some people I even know, right? Like the Mark Andreessens of the world. It's like they become ultra wealthy and all they do is shit post on Twitter and go on podcasts. And it's like I've already made it, right?
It's like you could you
Maybe
could
the
have done that before you made $1 billion, right? Yeah.
right, yeah. And if you push the rationalism, and I consider myself a kind of rationalist. It's like and Robin Hanson's all over this too. It's the sort of social veil and value, right? There's been studies showing that like the people's surveyed perception of the beauty of a flower is like tightly correlated with the rarity of that flower, right? Which should be totally irrelevant to our aesthetic preferences because scarcity is contingent. And if you really start to internalize that, then you start to realize, oh, these dandelions aren't weeds; they're beautiful flowers, right? This chicken nugget isn't some kid food; it's actually delicious, right? Like you're eating caviar, and you know fancy ceviche or whatever, and I'm eating a slice of Hawaiian pizza, and uh, if I feel less subjective well-being, that's because I'm trapped up behind some kind of social veil.
Hmm. That's interesting. Well, listen, we're running out of time. So before we wrap up, I just want to ask one practical question, which is like, in what ways do your thoughts about the future inform your life choices? And then also, what's your cat's name? Your cute tabby in your blog. I'm also a cat lover, so.
Yeah, the audio might have picked up him vomiting on my backpack
Oh
while we're going.
no.
Means he's hungry. Um, his name's Pumpkin because he's big and orange. Um, what am I doing? So, I mean, first order, I shifted back into AI policy. Um, again, sort of like connecting it back to my thread on like welfare policy was this this realization that industrialization was this package deal, right? And now I'm trying to think through like what are the new package deals that we're going to have. Um, and how else am I preparing? Well, this is investment advice, but just holding. I'm long the market, obviously, and I've also been thinking. Richard No from OpenAI had a tweet a little while ago where he said, he noticed himself starting to be more risk averse,
Mhm.
right? Like riding a bike with a helmet when he never used to, stuff like that.
Because
Because
of longevity implications of AI, was that the
yeah,
reason?
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, we
Mm.
could be quite close to a lot of, um, kind of de facto immortality. So like, don't screw it up and and get hit by a car like a year before the singularity, right?
Yeah, I guess it doesn't translate to don't drink beer or eat burgers, because like that's just a more long run effect where
No, yeah,
maybe on
yeah.
the margin. Yeah, yeah.
So
Okay.
yeah, I'm even more sedentary.
Just wanted to give Sam a chance to, if you wanted to tell anyone where to find your paper or your blog or anything else that you wanted to point people to as resources to, if they're interested in diving in further.
Sure. I'm Ham and Cheese on Twitter. My Substack is secondbest.ca, and Foundation for American Innovation is where I work. It's the FAI.org.